Good morning. Good morning. Come on, good morning. Happy 4th, happy 250, happy whatever makes you realize it's 112 degrees outside. I was in Montana last week in 62-degree weather. I know what heaven feels like. So good. I missed last week, and I hear that there was questions to Pastor Katie. Why was there no dad joke? I apologize for her. She should know way better. I don't know if you know or if you heard, but this past week up the street, the school on Greenway, there was a kidnapping. It ended okay. He woke up and went home. Here's the deal. Here's what's fun about this, is every time that I hear somebody go, so dumb, I win. That's the point. That's victory. That's game on. So, man, I missed last week. I'm so glad to be back. Pastor Katie nailed it last week. Wow. What a great teaching on covenant. Just so good. Hey, this morning, we are jumping into a new series. We're going to walk through a book of the Bible, and I had them make a slide that I want to go up because probably no one in here knows how to spell this book of the Bible. So I need you to, if you have a copy of God's Word, I need you to open it, turn it on, and get to Habakkuk. Habakkuk. Do we have a slide that just says Habakkuk? If not, we'll have a spelling bee to see who can spell Habakkuk. Oh, there. Let's put that up there. I think. There it is. Habakkuk. It's in your table of contents. You won't find it just flipping through. You're going to have to go to the table of contents and find Habakkuk. And we're gonna take a journey through there this morning. Habakkuk chapter 1, we're going to begin. We're going to take a few weeks and walk through this small book. Just to give you a little bit of background, Habakkuk is a prophet. In the Bible, there's what's called major prophets and minor prophets. And really, it's not who had a bigger voice or a lesser voice. It's just that for some reason, it's the length of the book that was written. The message is just as powerful. The message is just as important. The message has just as much value. The message of the Old Testament points to Jesus from the beginning to the end of the Old Testament. And every piece of it has the same redeemable, life-changing value. So when we hear major prophet and minor prophet, it's not a value statement. It's the size or the length of the book that was written. And each of these prophets still had influence, and we today are a byproduct of each of these prophets. And so Habakkuk is one of the minor prophets. I don't know what's going to happen when we get to heaven. If there's going to be like, oh, you were a major prophet. You were minor. Sorry, Art, you're a minor. We're going to hang out with the major. I don't know how it'll work, but this word is just as important. Habakkuk was written in like a lot of the prophetic books, was written during an upheaval and a disbursement of the Hebrew people, a clear attack on them. And Habakkuk had gone to the Lord and had this conversation with the Lord. We're going to read through this. We really could call the book of Habakkuk when God gets it wrong. That's kind of how Habakkuk starts. When God misses the mark, when God needs a scolding, is what could be a secondary theme of Habakkuk. If you're at Habakkuk chapter 1, will you stand with me, please? And we're going to begin our journey through Habakkuk in the next few weeks. It will take us a while to get through it. Habakkuk chapter 1, this is the message that the prophet Habakkuk received in a vision. How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Violence is everywhere. I cry, but you do not come to save. Must I forever see all these evil deeds? Why must I watch all this misery? Wherever I look, I see destruction and violence. I'm surrounded by people who love to argue and fight. The law has become paralyzed, and there is no justice in the courts. The wicked far outnumber the righteous, so that justice has become perverted. Jesus, help us to see you through the lens of Habakkuk. Help us to lay down presumptions and pride and prejudices and doctrine, denominations and tradition, and just simply see Jesus. Lord, may we not just gather this morning, but can we assemble and leave here with a united heart, an engaged vision, better equipped to influence every person we meet towards your kingdom. And all City Church said, amen. That was a pathetic amen. You may sit down. Have you ever had a prayer that you were embarrassed to pray? Or somebody confessed a prayer to you that you're like, I wouldn't pray that. In youth ministry, I remember it clearly in our youth ministry. Tracy and I were youth pastors for 17 years, and there was a season where I was doing a teaching on emotional purity and physical purity, and I had a mom come in and visit with me about her son, and she was very distraught. She was like, Pastor, you need to get through to my son. He's 16, almost 17, and he's really starting to have an attraction towards girls. And I didn't have the heart to say, well, it's not starting. You're just seeing. And she said, I'm very concerned that he's going to compromise his purity. And she's very upset. And she says, and we've been arguing about it at home. We've been arguing about how much time he can spend with girls and what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. And I'm so angry with this arguing. I'm so fed up with arguing with my son. And she says, I'm just going to pray that his falls off. I'm like, I wouldn't, no. As your youth pastor, I don't know I'd do that. Little extreme, Mom. I think the truth is we've all had prayers that if we were honest, if the veil was pulled, we'd be embarrassed that they even existed. And Habakkuk prays that. Not prayers that say, God, I don't understand. Let's go a little deeper. Not prayers that say, God, I'm really struggling. Let's go a little deeper. But honest prayers where we say, God, I think you're wrong. In the transparency of this room, I think we've all had that prayer. God, I completely disagree with how you're handling this. Or, are you kidding me, God? You think I deserve this? We're going to get very real in the transparency of Habakkuk. We're not, and what I just said, it's like there's this unwritten rule in Christianity, we're not allowed to say it out loud. Like, don't, I wouldn't, don't say that loud. But life doesn't allow us to not feel that way. My brother died last November of cancer. I don't really like that happened. Why did he have to die of cancer? Why did he have to die? He's not even the oldest of the family. I don't really like how God handled that. Maybe we can ask, why is my child sick? Why did my child get this diagnosis? God, whose idea was this? God, why did my marriage fail? Why do I feel betrayed? God, you said I got married and I upheld the covenant, and all I've got is pain. Lord, why has addiction been allowed to ravage my family? Why is it generational? Why can't we seem to break it? God, why does it look like evil people keep winning and good people keep losing? If we're honest, our greatest struggle is not believing that God exists. Our greatest struggle is believing that his way is better than mine. And as we read Habakkuk, it's not an atheistic position. It's not like, God, I don't even think you exist. It's not doubting the presence of God. Obviously, he believes God's real, or he wouldn't be talking to him. He's in the room. Habakkuk is just questioning whether God's doing his job or not. I believe in all transparency. I don't want to presume. I think in all reality, as your pastor, I hope it doesn't blow your mind, but I've wondered if God's doing his job. In the catastrophes and the pains and the laws that govern life. We go through it. I met with someone this week that just said, man, I've been praying, I've been waiting, I've been reading, I've been worshiping, I've been obeying, I've been disciplined. In fact, I've done all of those more than I normally do those. I've cried out to God. Have you not ever had that prayer where you get home, slam the door, run to the bedroom, hit your knees in the hallway, slide to the bed, hit the bed and scream out, God! And you'd like to swear, where the are you? And maybe you're looking at me like you're pure. Maybe you don't think about swearing. I do. We don't have to look very far to find suffering, do we? In fact, suffering seems to find us. One text. One phone call. One headline. One patient portal message of a recent medical visit. One funeral. One pink slip. One prodigal child. And it finds us, and suddenly in that finding, we find ourselves saying, God, where are you? Are you okay if we get this real today? The book of Habakkuk starts out kind of harsh, but it gets gooder. What amazes me about Habakkuk's question is not so much the question, but God's response. And we're going to look at that in a minute. What's puzzling is God didn't rebuke him. God didn't shame him. We have such a good God. God lets Habakkuk unload, and then he just answers him. Verse 5 of chapter 1, it says, the Lord replied, look around at the nations, look and be amazed, for I am doing something in your own day, something you wouldn't even believe if someone told you about it. That's how God starts out his answer. No rebuke, no correction, no head slap, no grounding, no takeaway privileges. No, you're in trouble for the tantrum. He's like, bro, I got this. I want to give you some freedom today. Questions don't weaken your relationship with God. Silence does. We're convinced in our Christian walk that there's two kinds of people. Let's be honest today. There's two kinds of people. There's the kind God talks to, and then there's me. That's how we categorize Christian maturity. And then we justify, well, of course God talked to Moses. He's Moses. Yeah, well, of course he talked to David. Have you seen the brother's book that he wrote? He talked to Habakkuk. He's got to. He's a prophet. He's in the Bible. In fact, there's books named after these guys. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Habakkuk, Joshua, John. There's books named after him. He had to talk to them, but I'm just Russ. I don't know if he talks to me. If we're honest today, I think we're good at that categorizing people in the Christian walk. But yet, Scripture never makes that distinction. It doesn't say that. We just assume it. Here's good news. God talks to very ordinary people. Exodus chapter 2, verse 23, it reads like this. Years passed and the king of Egypt died, but the Israelites continued to groan under the burden of slavery. They cried out for help, and their cry rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant that he promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he looked down on the people of Israel, and he knew it was time to act. I mean, this is years of slavery. This is years where people have been rejected. This is years of people that have rejected God. These are years of people that have decided that the Egyptian gods were more valuable than this God. These are years of them denying God's existence to prove their loyalty to the Egyptian people. This is years of this. And what did we read? We read Israel cried, God heard, God remembered, God saw, God acted. Very ordinary, broken people. Genesis 21, if we go back from Exodus to Genesis, it says, when the water was gone, she, her name being Hagar, put the boy in the shade of a bush. Then she went and sat down by herself about 100 yards away. I don't want to watch the boy die, she said as she burst into tears. But God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven. Hagar, what's wrong? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Do you see a simple slave woman, a little baby in the remote desert crying under a bush. No crowd, no church, no dynamic worship band, no veil to hide behind, Sunday best. And God shows up. And notice he says to Hagar, what we read, it says that he saw the weakest link. I heard the baby. I heard the weakest part of this whole story, crying. Wow. He doesn't just talk to the Moses and Elijah and Jeremiah. He talks to the crying baby. And let's be honest, most crying babies are selfish. We pretend we don't believe that. Oh, he's so cute. He's just so cute. He's a selfish little brat. What? Let's be real. Demanding their own way. Like, you can't sit in your poop another hour? Relax. You're hearing from a dad of 6. By child number 5 is like, change your own diaper, bro. We're out. Some of y'all might want to pray for Tracy. I don't know. We do. Yeah. Maybe this word is why you came here today. Because you think nobody sees your struggle. No one understands your pain. No one hears your prayers. You wonder, do my prayers just hit the ceiling? I want to tell you today that they don't hit the ceiling, they make it to the throne. They make it to the throne. David said in Psalm 8, when I look at the night sky and see the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you set in place, what are mere mortals that you would think about them? Human beings that you would even care. David looks at the billions of stars, the galaxy, somehow in David's day, the depth of creation crept in. He had somehow, without a telescope, could see. He says at one point that the firmament displays the grace of God. He says at another point that God's supply is longer than any known coastline. Somehow David had this insight of the size, the gigantic blessing, the enormity of this God, the creativity of this God, the beauty of this God, the expression of this God. And it blew David away that he went, how do you even have time to think about me? That's the God that Habakkuk is talking to. I have a whole another part of this sermon that during worship the Lord has changed directions of where I need to go today. I hope you'll go with me. This may be one of the most difficult roads that I've been on for a while. I bring it that we can leave here today better equipped to influence people towards His kingdom and not our battles. Isn't that what we do? How's life? Whew! Let me tell you, busy, full, tiring, exhausted. No time. Can't catch up. We need rest. Wow, you should hear about. Did you hear what that one person said about me? Have you? When was the last time our opening line was in all transparency? Man, life is battle, but there's this God that created billions of galaxies, and He has time for me. Wow. Maybe today you need someone to step into your pain. July 4th has a certain significance in our family. July 4th, 2009, Tracy and I were pastoring Midtown Church. July 4th, 2009 was a Saturday. We had opened up our church and our campus to the neighborhood to come over for barbecues and lawn games. And our building was in proximity to where the community fireworks display would happen. So people would come and set up lawn chairs and blankets. And we had a church that had a flat roof. People would go up on the roof and watch the fireworks. Did it every year. July 4th, 2009. Our youngest son, Preston, 8 years old at the time, was playing with his best friend, Jasmine. They were playing. There was probably 40 or 45 people on the roof that night, and that wasn't extraordinary. It was a common occurrence. And Preston and Jasmine were playing on the ductwork on the top of the building. I was in Montana last week, and I visited the site of 17 years ago. I have a picture of Jasmine. Do you have that ready back there, Travis? Thank you. Jasmine was 8 years old, and they were playing on the roof of the building, and Jasmine was crawling on some of the ductwork, and she reached across a 9-inch gap, and she was electrocuted and killed. "17 years ago, Jasmine went to heaven. It devastated me. It's not about me, it's about this little girl and her family. I began to ask those questions. Why'd you let an 8-year-old little girl die on my watch? In front of my 8-year-old son, who now has nightmares, who now at 8 years old wets the bed out of fear. Who's in charge up there? Hello? Went into 3 years of insurance companies and lawyers and lawsuits and accusations and inspections and trying to get my children. My 18-year-old daughter was on the roof as well, and she went into a place where she was so fearful of electricity, she couldn't even plug in her own curling iron out of fear of it killing her. At the end of 3 years, 2012, the church and our staff were found, we were not responsible. We had taken every precaution we could when we did the building remodel, and it all proved out. It didn't bring Jasmine back. Didn't help my son sleep any better. Didn't prevent 2 years later in 2014 because the church had lost so much momentum that we had to make a decision to close the church. I was in a dark place. I was in a dark place. As I continue my transparency today, I actually had to go to my board of elders and sit with them and tell them how dark I was and how well I'd hidden it from them. I had to confess to them that in the previous year, at the beginning of 2013, I had to confess in 2012, I didn't write a single sermon. I would download them Saturday night, call them my own, and plagiarize the whole thing. Submitted my resignation. I knew I needed some help, some deep help. So I went and found someone that I could let into my world. Dave, if you'll have the band come up. I needed to let someone in. So I met with the chaplain of the sheriff's office because I knew that he saw trauma every day. And I sat with that man and told him where I was and the dark place I was in, and for the first time in years was vulnerable to anyone. And he said, Russ, you need to stop blaming yourself and start blaming God. And I was like, oh, bro, you're going to get toasted right here in front of me. Like, I promise you, I physically moved my chair back from the table. Like, it is going down in this restaurant. Pastor Chuck is going to be Pastor Cooked. And he could tell by the look on my face that I was like, that's not why I'm here, dude. And he said, I dare you to read the Psalms and circle all the times that David accuses God. David says statements like this: why have you abandoned me and want me to die? To God. David says, I'm in a cave and I'm more lonely than my body can handle. Why aren't you with me? David says in the Psalms, you love my enemies more than me. David says in the Psalms, my children have died and you didn't even help. Yet at the end of every psalm, where David expressed the transparency of his frustration, he said this: but you are God, and you are good, and that's where I'm going to land. I had to do that in 2014, 5 years after Jasmine's death. If I'm honest with you, last Friday, July 3rd, as I stood at the place where Jasmine died, I had to conclude, but you are God, and you are good. And I hope today, I need our board and spouses to come up and be prepared to pray. Pastor Katie, Nick. I hope my transparency has proven that today's sermon is not about me. I asked God why for years. And you know what I just realized 17 years later? So that I could be here today and bring the message of hope. So that today, you'd know your prayers made it to the throne and didn't stop at the ceiling. So that today, you don't have to journey alone. And that is good enough for me. Will you stand? We are not dismissed. That will happen when Pastor Katie comes up. As the band leads us through some song they weren't prepared to lead us through, will you let someone join you today on your journey? Will you let this very trusted part of our church lay hands on you and agree with you? Minimum, will you tell God that you're not so sure he loves you right now, but you'd like to know that he does? And that you've got parts of your life you just don't trust him? Because when we read in a few weeks, Habakkuk became a new man. He got set free. Because he finally told God, I didn't like you, but now I can't stop loving you. Can you do that in the next few minutes? Can you just be real? Can you break down the religious tradition the lies that keep us prisoner. He already knows how you feel. He's God. Will you confess it this morning and begin the healing journey? And will you please let someone step into your life this morning? One of these up here as the band leads us. David.